January 27, 1945. Luzon, the Philippines. The sun had barely risen when the jungle began to whisper with the sound of boots, rifles, and quiet American voices. They were ghosts, not in the sense of death, but in the sense of what they were about to do. Vanish behind enemy lines, in the heart of Japanese-held territory, and bring their brothers home. They were Rangers. Men trained to do what no one else dared. But even among them, this mission seemed insane. Just a few miles away, beyond the rice paddies and barbed wire, stood a Japanese prison camp called Cabanatuan, a place whispered about in horror by every American survivor of Bataan and Corregidor. 3 years earlier, in 1942, over 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers had surrendered to the Japanese, the largest surrender in U.S. military history. The survivors were forced on the Bataan Death March, a brutal 100-kilometer trek under the blazing tropical sun. Thousands died on the road. Those who lived were sent to camps like Cabanatuan. By 1945, when MacArthur's forces had returned to liberate the Philippines, around 500 American prisoners still languished there, emaciated, broken, forgotten by time. The Japanese guards knew their defeat was near, and they had orders. If American forces came too close, every prisoner was to be executed. So, when U.S. intelligence learned that the Japanese were preparing to kill the remaining POWs, the Rangers were called in. Their orders were clear: rescue them before it's too late. The man chosen to lead was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, a hard, charismatic leader who commanded the elite 6th Ranger Battalion. With him was Captain Robert Prince, a quiet but brilliant tactician who would plan the assault itself. But it wasn't just Americans who would go. They had help from the Alamo Scouts, expert recon soldiers, and from hundreds of Filipino guerrillas who knew the land better than anyone. Together, they would form one of the most daring rescue teams in modern military history. Their mission: infiltrate 30 miles behind Japanese lines, cross open fields crawling with enemy patrols, and storm a heavily fortified prison camp, all while outnumbered more than 20 to 1. Every inch of the plan demanded perfection. Every mistake meant death. On the night before they moved, Mucci gathered his men. He looked at their faces, farmers, carpenters, college boys turned soldiers, and said simply, "Tomorrow night, we go in. We get our boys out, every one of them, or we die trying." In the humid silence of that jungle, not one man objected, because in the U.S. Army, "No man left behind" wasn't a slogan. It was a promise. The column moved silently through the Filipino countryside, a line of ghosts gliding between the palm trees and sugarcane. There were 121 Rangers, 2 Alamo Scouts, and around 200 Filipino guerrillas under Captain Juan Pajota. Together, they crept closer to the most dangerous place in the Pacific. The heat was suffocating. The men had been marching for hours, carrying rifles, grenades, and radio gear through mud that clung like glue. But no one complained. Every man knew what waited at the end of this road: American prisoners who had survived starvation, torture, and years of captivity. The closer they got, the louder the sound of war became. Japanese convoys rolled down the main road to the north. Planes droned above. And the Rangers knew that one wrong step could bring hundreds of enemy soldiers crashing down on them. That's when they saw it, the Cabanatuan camp. A cluster of low bamboo huts surrounded by high fences, guard towers, and machine guns. Beyond it lay an open field nearly half a mile wide. No cover, no trees, nothing but rice paddies and death. To reach the camp, the Rangers would have to cross it, under the eyes of the guards. Captain Robert Prince studied the terrain through his binoculars. He knew that the Japanese kept nearly 3,000 troops nearby, enough to annihilate his small force. A direct assault was suicide, so he devised something bold. They would attack at night, during a moonless sky. Filipino guerrillas would block both roads leading to the camp, ambushing any Japanese reinforcements.
Meanwhile, Rangers would crawl across the field, flat on their stomachs, using the darkness for cover. But there was one more problem. A Japanese observation post stood less than a mile away, with a clear view of the entire camp. Any noise, any movement, and the alarm would be raised. So the guerrillas proposed a distraction. One of them, a brave man named Eduardo Yosin, led a carabao cart onto the road in plain view of the Japanese. He acted drunk, shouting and cursing at his animal, pretending to be a harmless farmer. When the Japanese guards started laughing, Yosin's men quietly cut the telephone wires. The camp was now isolated. As the sun began to sink, the Rangers took their positions. At 7:30 p.m., they began crawling through the tall grass, 1 inch at a time. The field was so flat that even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. For over an hour, 121 men moved forward like shadows, their uniforms soaked with sweat, hearts pounding in the dark. Then, a flare burst in the distance. A Japanese truck had stumbled into one of the guerrilla roadblocks. The distraction worked perfectly. The guards turned their attention to the road, leaving their flanks exposed. Prince looked at his watch. It was time. He whispered into his radio, "Rangers, move." And with that, the silence of the jungle shattered. Machine guns opened fire. Explosions tore through the night. The impossible rescue had begun. The first shots cracked through the night like thunder over the fields. Tracer rounds streaked red and green through the darkness as the Rangers opened fire on the watchtowers. Within seconds, 2 Japanese sentries slumped forward, their machine guns silenced before they could sound the alarm. Captain Prince sprinted forward, shouting for his men to follow. Behind him, Rangers threw grenades into the guard posts, while others cut through the barbed wire with wire cutters. The camp was alive now, screams, gunfire, and confusion everywhere. Inside the huts, hundreds of gaunt, skeletal men jolted awake. For a moment, they didn't understand what was happening. Was it another execution? Another punishment? Then they heard it, the voice of an American Ranger shouting, "Get down! We're Yanks! We're here to get you out!" It didn't seem real. Some prisoners wept.
Others crawled out of their huts in disbelief, staring at the strange figures in the dark, young men with rifles, American accents, and courage blazing in their eyes. Lieutenant Henry Mutchie and Captain Prince moved through the chaos like men possessed. Their orders were clear: every prisoner must live. The Rangers moved fast. They cleared each building, shouting to the POWs to gather near the gate. Many of the prisoners were too weak to walk, little more than skin and bone after 3 years of starvation. So the Rangers began to carry them, on their backs and their arms, any way they could. Meanwhile, Japanese resistance began to mount. From the far end of the camp, a machine gun opened up, spraying the huts. Sergeant John McGowan dropped to one knee and fired 3 quick bursts. Silence. Another tower erupted. Rangers hurled grenades until it vanished in flame. Outside the camp, the Filipino guerrillas were fighting like lions. On the northern road, Captain Pahoda's men ambushed an entire Japanese column, blasting trucks and motorcycles with bazookas and machine guns. The sound of the battle echoed through the jungle, masking the Rangers' retreat. Back in the camp, chaos turned to order. The last guards were dead or fled. The prisoners, 513 Americans, were free. But freedom in the middle of enemy territory meant nothing without escape. They had to move fast. The Japanese garrison at Cabanatuan would soon realize what had happened. Reinforcements could arrive within minutes. Mutchie barked the order, "Move! Get them out, now!" The Rangers formed a human chain, lifting the prisoners over ditches and fences. They loaded the weakest onto stolen Japanese carts pulled by carabaos. Some men clung to the sides, refusing to let go. The column began its long, silent march back through the darkness. 500 liberated souls, 121 Rangers, and hundreds of Filipino guerrillas guarding them like shadows. Behind them, the camp still burned, a symbol of 3 years of suffering turned into fire and freedom. The mission wasn't over yet. Now came the hardest part,
getting home alive. The night swallowed them whole. 500 men, weak, wounded, and half-starved, moving through enemy territory like shadows. The jungle around them hissed with the sound of insects and the distant rumble of engines. Somewhere out there, the Japanese were regrouping. Every step mattered. Every sound could mean discovery. Captain Prince walked near the front, whispering to the guides. Filipino scouts led the way with uncanny skill, steering the column through hidden trails and shallow riverbeds to avoid detection. Behind them, rangers carried prisoners on stretchers made of bamboo and ponchos, their boots squelching in the wet mud. Some prisoners begged to be left behind. They knew they were slowing everyone down. But every time someone said those words, a ranger would look him in the eye and growl, "Not tonight, buddy. You're going home." For hours they moved like that, through creeks, over fields, under the canopy of palm trees that shielded them from the moonlight. Then came the sound that froze every heart. Engines, trucks, voices. A Japanese patrol had spotted movement near the road. Moments later, gunfire erupted.
Bullets tore through the darkness, snapping branches overhead. Captain Pajota and his guerrillas were ready. From their ambush positions along the Cebu River, they unleashed hell, bazookas, mortars, and machine guns roaring in unison. The Japanese reinforcements never stood a chance. In less than 15 minutes, over 200 enemy soldiers were dead or scattered. But the noise had drawn attention from miles around. If they stayed, they'd be surrounded by dawn. Mucci gave the order to keep moving. The Rangers pushed their exhausted column onward, deeper into the jungle. By midnight, the rain began to fall. Heavy tropical rain that turned paths into rivers. Men slipped, fell, and got back up again. Some POWs fainted and were carried for miles. One ranger, Private First Class Preston, carried 2 men at once, one on each shoulder. He never complained. Dawn crept over the horizon, pale and humid. The men had been marching for nearly 10 hours straight. When they finally reached the Pampanga River, the current was too strong to cross safely. The Rangers stared at the rushing water. Behind them, they could hear distant gunfire. The Japanese were coming. Without hesitation, Filipino guerrillas cut down bamboo trees and lashed them together into makeshift rafts. One by one, they ferried the prisoners across under the cover of fog. Some nearly drowned, but the Rangers dove in after them. No one was left behind. When the last man reached the opposite bank, they collapsed in exhaustion, too tired even to speak. They had done the impossible, crossed enemy lines, stormed a camp, freed 513 men, and survived the night. But they weren't safe yet. The Japanese army was combing the countryside, searching for the ghosts who had humiliated them. The Rangers would have to keep moving for 2 more days before they reached friendly lines. For now, they rested, wet, shivering, and alive. One of the prisoners looked up at the Rangers who guarded the perimeter and whispered, "Boys, I thought you forgot about us." A Ranger smiled, dirty and exhausted. "Never," he said. "America doesn't forget its own." 2 days later, the jungle broke open into the wide plains near American lines. The Rangers could see the faint shimmer of tents and trucks in the distance, the edge of the U.S. advance on Luzon, but none of them cheered. Not yet. They were too tired, too wary of traps. They moved carefully, silently, until the first American sentry shouted, "Holy hell! Who are you guys?" Henry Mucci stepped forward, his uniform torn, his face streaked with mud. "6th Rangers," he rasped. "We brought some friends." Moments later, the camp exploded with chaos. Not the chaos of battle, but of joy. Doctors rushed in with stretchers. Medics cried as they saw the condition of the prisoners. Men reduced to skeletons, their eyes sunken, their skin paper-thin. Some POWs couldn't stop shaking. Others just smiled faintly, too weak to speak. One of them, a survivor of the Bataan Death March, grabbed a ranger's hand and whispered, "I thought we were already dead." The ranger squeezed back. Not anymore. Word of the rescue spread like wildfire.
Within hours, General MacArthur himself received the report. All 513 prisoners rescued.
0 left behind. Even for the battle-hardened commanders of the Pacific, it was almost unbelievable. In Washington, newspapers broke the story with headlines that seemed like fiction. U.S. Rangers pull off daring rescue behind enemy lines. All prisoners saved, none lost. Across America, families who had long assumed their sons were dead read the names of survivors in stunned disbelief. Mothers wept over breakfast tables. Fathers sat in silence, staring at the words "rescued alive." For the Rangers, there was no parade, no celebration. After a few hours of rest, most of them were ordered back into combat. But they didn't complain. They had fulfilled their promise. Captain Robert Prince later said it was the most exhausting night of his life and the proudest. Colonel Mucci told his men, "Gentlemen, you've done something that will live as long as the United States Army does." Historians would later call it one of the greatest rescue missions in military history, an operation so precise, so impossible, that it became legend almost overnight. But for the men who lived it, it wasn't about glory. It was about faces. The faces of the men they carried out of that hellhole, the gratitude in their eyes, the trembling hands that wouldn't let go. It was about a promise. No man left behind. And on that humid Philippine night in the ruins of Cabanatuan, America proved it was more than words. In the months that followed, the war in the Pacific raged on. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the firebombing of Japan. The world was still burning. But somewhere deep in that inferno, the story of Cabanatuan became a quiet symbol of hope. For the rescued prisoners, the return home was almost unreal. They stepped off transport ships in San Francisco and were met with crowds waving flags, tears streaming down faces that had waited 3 long years. But behind every embrace lay memories that words could never erase. The heat, the hunger, the cruelty of captivity. One survivor, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Dias, later wrote, "When I saw those Rangers in the dark, I knew that America had not forgotten me. That single truth kept me alive afterward." The Rangers themselves faded back into anonymity. Captain Robert Prince returned home, humble and quiet, refusing to call himself a hero. Colonel Henry Mucci went on to train new soldiers, his voice still carrying the same conviction: discipline, courage, loyalty. Captain Juan Pajada, the Filipino guerrilla commander, went back to his village, never seeking medals or money. But every man who had fought under him called him a legend. The Alamo Scouts continued their missions, silent, invisible, undefeated. Not one scout was ever lost in combat. And in the jungles of the Philippines, the burned ruins of Cabanatuan were reclaimed by vines and silence. Today, a small memorial stands where the huts once stood, a place where sunlight filters gently through the palms and the wind carries the faint echo of men who refused to die forgotten. The rescue at Cabanatuan wasn't about strategy or statistics. It was about faith. Faith that no matter how far behind enemy lines, no matter how hopeless the odds, American soldiers would come for their own. Outnumbered, outgunned, out in the middle of nowhere. And still, they came. When history remembers the Pacific War, it often speaks of grand battles and mighty fleets. But sometimes, the truest measure of courage is not how many enemies you defeat, but how many brothers you bring home. As one ranger later said, standing at the camp's ruins decades later, "We didn't go in there for medals. We went because those were our boys. And in our army, no man gets left behind."